This video was sponsored by Wooden Boards. Stuck in a farmhouse or apartment with zombies at every entrance? Don't have a fridge to keep them away from your delicious noodles? Use Wooden Boards, the original protection from undead invasion. 1 out of 7 survivors recommend. So you found yourself in a pretty bleak situation. A virus has infected much of the country, or at least that's what you assume. In your tiny sanctuary, the news offers little help and your resources are going to dwindle fast. You're in it for the long haul, alone, cut off from those you love. And worst of all, the only company you have is anything but hospitable. The pale, shambling ghouls stalk you from beyond your door, craving your flesh when all they should be craving is a burial plot. So lock up your doors, turn up the volume on your friendly neighborhood news station, and start rationing resources. Because this is the world of the Night of the Living Dead. Or is it perhaps the world of #alive? I'm V for Verbatim, and I'm the kind of person that'll be ranting about movies until zombies devour my brains. Today we're going to be starting with a series called Z-Movie Comparisons, name and trademark pending, where we put zombie flicks head-to-head in an entirely objective position of scrutiny. We'll be discussing their strengths, weaknesses, and anything in between in these next 30-40 minutes, all in relation to their major selling point: zombies. Zombie movies are a special brand of horror movie that can make you reassess your country's social and political landscape 1 second, and make you question why you're watching such a stupid movie the next. Needless to say, we've got a varied road ahead of us, with as many smooth sailing scenic routes as there are speed bumps and potholes. We're starting the series off with the grandfather of the zombie horror genre, and its young overseas descendant, Romero's Night of the Living Dead and Cho Il-hyung's #alive. The former is the beginning of Romero's influential Living Dead series, and it follows the story of Barbara and Ben, 2 survivors of a widespread epidemic of cannibalism and violence, initiated by the recently deceased. They must survive the night in a nearby farmhouse with ghouls on their doorstep and inside the house itself, all while the government gradually reveals what they know over the last connection they have to the outside world: their radio and television. #alive similarly is the story of Jun Woo and Kim Yoo-bin, 2 survivors of a widespread epidemic of cannibalism and violence initiated by the recently infected. They must survive for several weeks in nearby apartment complexes with zombies on their doorstep and in the apartments themselves, all while the government gradually reveals what they know over the last connection they have to the outside world: television and radio frequencies. There are a lot of technical story differences, but the similarities and the basic premises make them interesting movies to compare, especially given the over 50 years in between their initial release dates. So, without further ado, let's talk about zombies then versus zombies now. So here's a bit of a crash course of all that went down around the time of this movie. And strap in because we're going to be going over things real quick for this one. 1954, Civil Rights Movement. Racially motivated violence and separate but equal mentality were combated by nonviolent protests led by figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and Bayard Rustin, and the Black Power movement led by Malcolm X. Both made significant strides for the sake of African American communities, and both were ultimately assassinated. 1947, because the world was just so horny for war after World War II, capitalist and communist nations went head-to-head to see who would end the world the quickest. Less deadly, they also just fought against each other through less world-ending outlets like the Olympics and the space race. It was a period of paranoia where people everywhere were bracing themselves for mass destruction. Wars during the Cold War include the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Chinese Civil War, the Cuban Revolution, and just lots of bloodshed and violence. 1932, the release of White Zombie. White Zombie is considered the first zombie film. The term zombie was originally associated with a loosely voodoo belief of reviving the dead to do one's bidding. The story of White Zombie takes this approach rather than the virus form zombies take today. I would argue that the film The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, a 1920 film featuring a hypnotist using a parasomniac to murder people, would be the first to fall into this original image of a hypnotized shambling figure attacking the living, but White Zombie is considered the first, and that's how we'll consider it moving forward. 1968, The Night of the Living Dead is released by George Romero, spawning a series of films released over decades that features the undead foes. Okay, take a second. Okay, break over. For #alive, we're going to have to take a more culture-based approach. Korea is a state that was broken up into 2 separate nations because of political differences. We won't be talking much about North Korea today, but just know that the southernmost part of Korea is what we will be discussing. South Korea was originally characterized by intensive subsistence agriculture and fishing until recent urban development. Since then, the South has become a capitalistic regime characterized by population clusters at urban centers. Multi-generational households are less of a thing in Korea, and birth rate is significantly low. Many families have one child only, similar to the declining family size seen in places like Japan. There's also a very interesting relationship between age groups in Korea. The elderly have experienced the struggles of the Cold War era. In contrast, the young have not experienced that kind of conflict but face employment strain and burnout. Many of Korea's youths are in jobs they find unfulfilling and don't pay particularly well. Some have taken more unconventional routes in life in order to a meaningful living. And the young are generally more in favor of modern approaches to life, global clothing and brands, technology, etc., rather than the traditional paths of their elders. Of course, this has created a disconnect between the two generations, but one issue seems to plague both: rising suicide rates. While the young are pressured to succeed to the point of seeing death as the only way out, isolation and loneliness has led to a similar thought process among the elderly. Last few things: Train to Busan and more recent events. Train to Busan was like Korea's Night of the Living Dead. It was a revitalization of zombies for the Korean audience and an introduction to Korean media for international audiences like the K-dramas before it. It inspired the creation of the movie sequel Peninsula, the movie #Alive, and more recently has even been referenced in the show All of Us Are Dead. Like Romero's movies, some of the best zombie media out of Korea puts a spotlight on modern cultural issues. And, of course, COVID. I think we all know how that's going, so there's no need to explain that one. The COVID situation was the basis for a 2020 film called Alone, which is about, and so I made this sounds familiar, a person barricading himself in an apartment during a zombie apocalypse. #Alive's director, Cho Il-hyung, has stated that this movie inspired his story's plot. There. And I will not be repeating myself. Sorry to bombard you with information like that, but we're going to be moving on now. So let's talk Outbreak. Here we're going to be discussing Outbreak scenes specifically. The strengths and weaknesses of the scenes in the context of their films will be determined, and a point will be awarded to the most effective. The outbreak in Night of the Living Dead starts out slow. Barbara and her brother Johnny only encounter their first school at a cemetery, but the situation gradually gets worse. Our other protagonist, Ben, tells this story to Barbara about seeing the zombies toppling an entire truck by themselves, so their numbers seem to be increasing rapidly off-screen, even on-screen when we see them surround the building. The outbreak started when a space probe exploded and spread radiation from the atmosphere. The zombies are shown to be cannibals that are simply reanimated corpses, but the daughter of the survivors, Mr. and Mrs. Cooper, becomes the first ever infected zombie. She is bitten and she becomes sick before dying and coming back to life to kill her family. Not counting opening credits, the apocalypse in #Alive is already in gear in the first 2 minutes. Protagonist and pro-gamer Jun Woo sleeps in while his family is out buying groceries without him. He turns on the news and hears about a district riot getting out of hand, spreading throughout Korea. Outside, the riot has already arrived. People are eating each other and attacking fleeing bystanders. The cause of the outbreak is not outright stated, so it can be assumed that this is a typical zombie virus spread by bodily fluids. The symptoms of the outbreak are in full display when Jun-woo's apartment is invaded by a man from a neighboring room. He was bitten, and when Jun-woo discovers this, the man begins to turn. His eyes bleed and he becomes rigid, performing a series of movements akin to a robot learning the Thriller dance. There's more of a focus on the physical transformation in this movie than in Romero's films, so while we don't understand the reason for the outbreak, we understand the effects the virus has on the individual, an important distinction of these two movies. #Alive is arguably more intimate in its presentation of a single person struggling to survive, while Night is more about the experience of a nation under crisis. The unknown factor of the outbreak, as well as the up-close and personal turning process, edge #Alive slightly above Night here. So the point for this round goes to #Alive. Next we have zombie types, more of a fun category. For Night of the Living Dead, we're dealing with the species Gulus aspersum under the order Romerum. A distinct feature of this species of zombie is the fact that they are called ghouls rather than zombies originally, hence the genus Gulus. Let's look at stats really quick. Strength, 3 out of 10. Our main man says that they have no strength at all, but also contradicts this with his truck toppling story. On screen, they're pushed over easily, but they can lift basic objects and they at least have the strength to use weapons effectively, so they get a few points. Speed, 2 out of 10. They're the slowest classic zombies. If you have 2 legs and you aren't stopping for selfies, speed isn't an issue. Intelligence, 6 out of 10. They use tools, and they're smart. Enough said. Infectivity, 3 out of 10. They don't actively try to bite you, and it's mostly the already dead people that come back. The real issue that earns them a few points is the fact that all the recently dead become zombies. A lot of people die every day, even without a zombie apocalypse. so you can imagine how quickly their numbers would get out of hand. Speaking of numbers, 5 out of 10. Manageable enough for a couple of rednecks to take them out, but clearly there is a significant number of people being infected here. HP, 3 out of 10. They don't regenerate or have any specific health advantage, and there are a lot of ways to take them down. They're easy to kill, and it only takes a little fire to ward them off. Overall, 22 out of 40. Not bad for Romero's first go-around. Let's move on to #alive. For this one, we have the species Zombis cornutum, under the order Peninsularos. A notable feature of these Zeds is the unique symptom of bleeding from the eyes before turning. The species cornutum is that of the Texas horned lizard, which can squirt blood from its eyes for self-defense. The more you know, I guess. Let's look at these stats. Strength, 5 out of 10. They can push entire fridges, and they can push on metal doors to various levels of success. I'd say they have an average human strength. Speed, 5 out of 10. They run about as fast as an average person can, which is quite the feat for a rigid corpse. Solid 5 out of 10 for speed. Intelligence, 3 to 7 out of 10. This one's a mixed bag and admittedly inconsistent. They didn't immediately run towards the officer in full daylight early on in the movie, but they do some things like opening doors and remembering the activities they once did. One firefighter zombie even remembers how to climb a rope, but it depends on the zombie. We're told they have a heightened sense of smell and hearing, but Jun-Woo is able to sneak past them just fine because plot. Not only that, but Yu-bin runs straight through a horde of them and doesn't get caught for a solid few minutes. For this inconsistency, zombie intelligence averages at around 5. Infectivity, 6 out of 10. The virus is transmitted by bodily fluids, and a bite turns a person into a walker in minutes. Once infected, they become ravenous and will actively seek out more people to add to their horde. Definitely more infectious than Romero zombies. Numbers, 7 out of 10. They take over Korea in less than a day. They're vast, and only those confined to their homes during the outbreak are able to make it through the first days. And that's only the first days. HP, 7 out of 10. Heights seem to be their main weakness when it comes to killing them. However, bullets can do the trick in some situations. The last scene with these zombies involves military men in a helicopter shooting them down to save the protagonists. I counted maybe a few dozen going down, but by the time they show an overhead shot with their helicopter flying upwards, only 9 or so are still lying on the ground after several hits. These ones are a little more durable than they first appear. Overall, the #alive zombies clearly score higher, nearly doubling the score of the night ghouls. This category, however, won't be taken into account unless there's a tie, so keep that in mind. Next, survival plan. For this one, we'll be discussing the survival plans of these movies' main characters. The character who makes the fewest zombie survival errors with a plan that offers the greatest chance for success will earn a point for this round. For Romero's Knight, let's look at Ben's plan. Boarding up the house and building reinforcements. A pretty effective strategy in this case. The ghouls are slow, so the plan allows for potential escape routes. Unfortunately, his strategy also involves him sharing his sanctuary with a bunch of stupid people that think bundling up in a cellar with an infected child is a good idea. His patience for dumbasses was his downfall, and his strength in this category suffers because of this. In #alive, we've got a couple of plans to go over. First, Jun-Woo's. He plans to stay holed up in his apartment until help arrives. He makes several life-saving decisions like pushing his infected neighbor out of his apartment, using resources like his drone wisely, saving Yu-bin from a zombie horde by calling an apartment unit away from hers, and posting his location on social media so that he could be found. But for every good decision he makes about 3 dumb ones. He calls attention to himself to save a woman from being dragged away. It doesn't even work, zombies go to his location. He doesn't stock up on water while it's still running. Day 10 rolls around and he's got nothing. But he makes 3 mistakes that are just so obviously terrible that any non-protagonist would die if they had even done one of these. 1. He drinks alcohol when he runs out of water, dehydrating himself further and reducing his awareness during a crisis. 2. He tries to hang himself, which is somewhat justified since he finds out his family is dead, but still not a great plan. And number 3. He runs into his apartment hallway to attract zombies for no reason other than blind anger. He cannot stay calm under pressure. Yu-bin, conversely, has all this climbing gear, a little stove, a brain in her skull, and survival instincts. She herself was also going to make an attempt to hang herself, but decided against it and ended up being there to save Jun-Woo. She used to be a climber before she fell and became afraid of heights. but she uses her knowledge to hook up a zip line to transport food and supplies between the two of them. Her plan relies on less stupid people than Ben's, but neither her nor Jung-woo are perfect. They both made mistakes that would have been fatal if they weren't the leads of the film, so the point for this category has to go to Ben. Despite him ultimately dying, his plan would have been the most effective given the situation he was in. Zombie movies are often remembered for their amazing kills, alive or dead. Whether it's a bride splitting a head with a chainsaw in Rec 3, or a bloke beating a bartender to the backdrop of a Queen song in Shot of the Dead, zombie kills can be entertaining and therapeutic to watch. So we're going to be going over the stats for these movies' kills and determine which had the strongest ones overall. For Night of the Living Dead, we had primarily push and gun kills. Most of the zombies were killed with a gentle nudge or a gunshot. Specific ones we will be talking about are forgettable deaths, best deaths, and most notable death. Here, the forgettable deaths are Mr. Cooper, gunshot by Ben, and Johnny, death by head trauma. Both deaths felt slow and could have been implemented better. Best deaths, we have Mrs. Cooper, death by trowel, and the teens, death by explosion. They were brutal, and they were a great opportunity to show off some amazing practical effects for the time. Most notable death, we have Ben, death by murraying. This was one gut-wrenching demise. He survived so many idiots actively threatening his survival, only to be shot down like his very attackers. Anybody who can effectively kill off their protagonist in a zombie movie is an MVP. Romero wins this round by default. But let's go over what the competition has to offer. For #Alive, we have primarily guns and falling kills. Unlike America, Korea is not handing out guns to their citizens through their local gun stores and Walmarts. They're more strict about the use of firearms, but that doesn't stop this movie from featuring guns so predominantly. If we count attempted hangings under falling deaths, falling comes in at a close second. The most forgettable deaths are, unfortunately, most of them. There weren't many particularly eventful Zed deaths here, mostly things that have already been done before. Best deaths, we have the firefighter zombie, death by falling, and the 8th floor stranger, death by mercy kill. The firefighter's hand is chopped off by Yubin as he climbs towards her apartment, causing him to fall. The fall is made memorable by the decapitated hand slowly losing its grip and plopping onto the ground in a moment of levity after the tension of the scene. The 8th floor stranger tried to feed Yubin to his infected wife, but ultimately gets himself eaten in the process. In a moment of calm, the stranger forgives his wife and tells her that he loves her. Yubin offers the mercy kill. It's a rushed, touching moment, but touching nonetheless. The most significant death has to go to Jung-woo's family. It's especially chilling because all you hear is a voice message from them as their hideout is overrun. Very effective use of technology. Like I said before, Romero's already an MVP here because he killed off the protagonist. But the deaths in his movie were also fewer and pretty personal, making them more impactful overall. The point goes to Night. This is a sort of miscellaneous section to discuss little production details that worked in this movie's favor or bogged it down. Whichever one has the most positive aspects will be awarded a point. Let's look at Night first. The movie was revolutionary for its time, especially gore-wise. But let's get into actual specific details. Practical effects. Mrs. Cooper's death is awesome because of the use of effects. The cuts between the daughter and Mrs. Cooper are a little cheesy by today's standards, but the splutters of blood from Mrs. Cooper's mouth were a nice touch and gave the illusion of impact pretty effectively. The teens exploding and being eaten by the ghouls is also a great use of ingenuity. The chicken bones and meat they used for the remains were brilliant and probably doubled as food for people on set. Now that's what I call efficiency. Shots. There's a lot of variety in shot types. Slightly off-tilt shots, like Dutch angles, were used effectively here to establish tone. One notable shot I want to mention is Barbara when she's entering the house for the first time. The light inside leaves everything else but her in shadows. It really emphasizes how alone she feels in an unknown situation, and it's done well. The same can't be said for scenes when the ghouls are reaching through the boards on the windows. They're soundless and the music feels overpowering at points, making it feel less real. Speaking of music and sound, the 60s music is perfect, but it's just way too loud. Sound editing also could have used one last check. Sometimes the crickets were too loud, or impacts like slaps and punches weren't loud enough. Pacing. The movie felt very slow. Everything fell apart in the last 20 or so minutes, with nothing much happening in the middle but bickering and lingering too long on shots of the radio, shots of Barbara's stoic face, more shots of the radio, then another 10 minutes of just staring at the TV screen. Scenes should have been cut down to be more concise. In short, this movie just feels like a product of its time and budget. But it's one of those movies that takes advantage of its low budget most of the time because it makes the movie feel more real when it needs to. It was effective in making this movie a cult classic. Let's look at specific details of #Alive now. Shot variety. Not much variety to note, but a few individual scenes were interesting. The use of lighting when Jun-Woo is drunk and hallucinating makes everything else look hopeless in his imagined world, where his family returns home safe and sound. When the protagonists call for help towards the end of the movie, we see wide shots of apartments from throughout the story, making the entire complex feel devoid of uninfected life, and the situation is far more bleak for the characters and the audience. The opening credits scene was also very World War Z-esque, with a sleek coat of paint to it. Other than that, though, not a lot of interesting or experimental camera work. Set design. The locations are few in number, but the gradual changes to backgrounds establish a passage of time effectively. Lots of colors to make certain objects pop, nice little details like portraits and electronics, all very welcome things. Music. The music in this movie had a modern air to it that added to the anxiety-inducing atmosphere. Special effects. This one was a hit or miss. The firefighter's hand falling didn't look entirely real because it wasn't. And it was part of the reason that the scene came off as very comical. The jerky movements of the newly infected looked poorly edited. The swarms are also a little too horde-breaking glass scene from Train to Busan, especially being a movie that came out 4 years after its predecessor. Pacing. It's an issue in this movie too. While it's never as overt as Night when screen time is being filled up, the middle does meander a little, and the 8th floor stranger story is rushed like the rest of the final act. This movie is a longer story forced to become more compact in a short allotted time, versus Night, which was given the challenge to stretch out their story for a longer time. Zombie makeup. The zombies have a beaten and bruised look to them thanks to the makeup. It works well given how the zombies pounce and violently attack their victims. The eyes especially are unsettling because they appear more inhuman than the eyes of the night ghouls. Another major difference for these films. To an extent, modern zombies are still us and are meant to be viewed as reflections of us. But elements of their features, their eyes, their blood, transformations, push the boundary of how inhuman zombies can be. And I guess it's up to individuals to decide whether that makes them a more effective allegory or not. Despite my labeling of Night as revolutionary, I'm going to have to give the points to #Alive for this one. It ultimately felt more polished than Night, which is due in part to its production being a half a century later. Forgive me, Romero, you're still the zombie king in my eyes. This category will vary by video, but here I will be comparing what makes these movies similar. In this case, their use of few locations and the effect it has on the movie. For Night, it could have been a little more effective. There was only so much that could have been done in a day of being swarmed by zombies. They didn't need to eat or get creative to survive, so it's all just boarding up everything. Later movies tend to either gloss over the building of reinforcements or keep their characters moving, which would have been preferable. Being stuck in a house with combative people does work well in this movie, though. Like a Twilight Zone episode, it puts a focus on how we as people interact under pressure. And in that way, this movie succeeds at making situations and confrontations the characters have feel unavoidable and somewhat claustrophobic in the surrounded farmhouse. In #Alive, all of the prep and reinforcements are shown in shorter scenes, which puts more emphasis on the psychological element of being in one location. Jun-Woo is isolated. He doesn't think he can survive, he doesn't know if his family is coming for him, and the amenities he once took for granted like video games, internet connection, and emergency services are being gradually plucked from his grasp. The house acts as both a place of safety and isolation. Other apartments we visit show this as well, like the 8th floor stranger and Yubin. They are quiet and confined locations and generally look very similar, but they reflect the stability and intentions of the owner brilliantly. Again, this point's going to have to go to #Alive due to how the movie makes the locations as active as the characters themselves. Round? Flat? Maybe something in between. The point in this category goes to the movie that offers the best characters and utilization of them. Let's look at Night. The characters in this one are very one-note. Mr. Cooper was a combative jerk, Mrs. Cooper was a calm and collected mother, Barbara was a brick wall. If Ben wasn't there being competent and actually making an effort to survive long-term, this movie would have felt more like a Twilight Zone episode than it already did. And I say that as a negative in this case. #Alive also has very one-note characters. Admittedly, simple characters are a staple of zombie movies. Jun-Woo is meant to be simple because he's a surrogate character for the audience. He's frustratingly stupid though, which can come across as endearing at some points and grating at others. Bin has a little bit of character, but it's just your typical hardcore survivor that's been done hundreds of times before. The eighth floor stranger is similarly basic in character. He's just the crazy guy that comes off as well-meaning. The growth of Jun-Woo over the course of the movie saves him as a character, but this movie occasionally tries to squeeze emotion out of you when the lack of build-up doesn't always warrant it. This one is a win for Romero. Despite Barbara being obnoxiously useless, and the characters being mostly flat, events are presented with a little more leeway for the audience to decide how they feel. #Alive also just doesn't get an excuse for flat characters, especially when character is such a focus of the film. Movies can age like fine wine if done right. The point for this category goes to the movie that'll be able to do just that. For Night of the Living Dead, while this movie is the origin of the zombie flick and holds up well in that regard, it has become even more relevant in these last few years with COVID. We were stuck at home with the government telling us how a virus beyond our complete understanding was ravaging the sick and elderly. Like the ghouls, it isn't an instant killer, but the number of infected is still rising around us. This movie resonates with those that understand the fear of what lies beyond the safety of our homes, the infection, the frustration of being stuck inside reaching a boil, and even worse, the fact that the virus has already made it past our impenetrable defenses in some cases. That's not even mentioning the fact that this movie's commentary on race relations remains significant to this day. The Black Lives Matter movement, being so recent, shows that despite our efforts to grow as a society, racially motivated violence is still an unjust reality for many in our country. It just makes that final moment with Ben a moment of sad relief when he believes he survived the many fatal errors of people who wouldn't listen to him and didn't see his survival plan, or maybe didn't even see him as a person. That much worse, because the relief is ended by a gunshot when he's labeled as one of the dead, one of the enemies, part of the virus. That's as far as I'll go into that, though. I'm white and Hispanic, so I don't have the right to really go into detail about a fundamental struggle unique to a group I don't belong to. I would implore you, though, as viewers, to look into this issue on your own, because it really is relevant. I can't say that the message in #Alive is as relevant to our culture, at least. I don't think I need to go into how this movie is actually relevant in terms of COVID, the virus keeping everyone locked in their houses. It's to the point that it's a little too on the nose for this one. The emotional core of this movie relies on the audience understanding that self-quarantine and social distancing. Because we've all lived through COVID these past few years, we can understand as an audience and can connect with this movie. This movie also effectively shows the culture of South Korea. While not as much political or social commentary shines through in this one as with stories like Squid Game or Train to Busan, this movie is at least very telling of the day-to-day life in Korea, especially during the COVID pandemic. Again, another point for Night of the Living Dead. Alive had the advantage of a recent release, but Night still stands as a thought-provoking film more than 50 years later. Night surpasses Alive at the moment, and only time will really tell how Alive holds up to a future audience. Last category, Apocalypse Swap. For this section, I will ask myself a pretty fun hypothetical question. Would these characters survive if they were put in each other's situations? Everything about their stories, except their character, would be swapped, including location, zombie type, characters, and, most importantly, ending. Consider it a time travel situation where they're dropped from one time period into another. Let's start with our first one, #LivingDead. Ben in Korea during this kind of virus would be a challenge. Like I said, character remains the same, so Ben wouldn't be a gamer or a younger man or anything. I think he would have a stronger will to survive towards the beginning. One thing that may initially seem like an issue, though, is language barrier. Ben would have no idea what was going on in the news, making the first encounter he has with the infected neighbor less of a clear danger to him. Two potential ways this could go. A, he watches the news about infection symptoms with English subtitles, or B, he's able to determine by his neighbor's erratic behavior and blood tears that something is wrong, and he puts two and two together. Based on that, the first zombie wouldn't be a problem. What about Bin? while communication again would be an issue. But consider Korean education. All students are required to take a second language course early on, and it's not just a yo hablo español and you get an A. It's intensive, and you know what the top two languages Koreans learn are? Chinese and English. Almost half of the population can at least speak a little bit of English. It's a coin toss, but Ju Bin might know basic English or would be able to figure out another method of communication. One thing that makes Ben equipped for this situation specifically is his attitude towards mobility. He sees the farmhouse as a place to stay for a short time, but he knows they need to have escape plans for when the ghouls finally start coming in. He's willing to leave, but isn't stupid enough to go outside and, say, save the cop woman from being eaten by zombies in #alive. He's not playing hero, and that's what's going to keep him alive. I also don't think Ben would use up his rations as quickly or resort to drinking as much liquor as Jung-woo to survive. I don't believe his sanity would deteriorate as fast as Jung-woo's either, but I also don't think it would be fair to say it would deplete slower. This is an entirely different situation for Ben, being in a country where he can only speak to half of its populace at best. For the sake of argument, let's say he still tried to hang himself. Either way, Jobin would have been there to stop him. The one issue that could threaten his life, funnily enough, is what if he woke up early and went out for groceries with his family? Yes, the family still exists. Don't ask me how that works. Well, I imagine his survival instincts would still kick in no matter where he was. As with when he saw ghouls topple an entire truck, he didn't stick around to figure out what was happening. Again, he has survival instincts, and he would be able to react quickly regardless of where he was, even if the virus is more dangerous here. Ben would actually be in a better position to enact his plan from Night of the Living Dead. So here's how I imagine the ending. Ben would leave his apartment, but Yobin would be dead. The firefighter zombie killed her in this version. Ben has the same tools as Jung-woo did to stop the zombie, but as a man from the 1960s, he doesn't know how to use it, so he's alone. He might stay with the 8th floor guy for a little while, he might not. Heck, Ben might realize he's untrustworthy right away and save himself some hassle. I'd like to believe that he'd leave the man behind with his wife without killing anyone, but he'd make his way up to the roof and be rescued by the military like in the original story. 1 point for Knight and for Ben for being a badass. Let's move on to the next one, Alive Among the Dead. Jung-woo at the farmhouse would be a much worse situation. The doors and windows are less secure, his access to internet connection is non-existent. He's surrounded by people as prone to dumb decisions as him, and virtually nobody in America spoke Korean in the 1960s. And in case you don't remember, this is the Cold War era. You know what happened around then? The Korean War, Vietnam, Communist China. Best case scenario, he's recognized as South Korean and nobody has a problem with him despite not speaking his language. Worst case scenario, somebody like Mr. Cooper lost his son when he was sent off to Vietnam and he shoots Jung-woo just for being Asian. And that's just cultural dangers. Suppose Jung-woo isn't killed on the spot. Is he going to be strong or smart enough to ward off ghosts at the farmhouse? Remember, he's still a gamer because this is a time travel thing. Gamers aren't known for being buff, and I'm sorry if that's a stereotypical assumption. But it shouldn't be a problem either way because boarding up windows doesn't take a lot of energy. It's not taxing to hammer in nails or hold up boards, so it is still plausible. Intelligence is where I'm not so sure. Would Jung-woo realize that ghouls don't like fire and take advantage of that? Possibly, closer to probably, if he sees the same truck turned over by the ghouls and the explosion that follows that Ben saw. So both of these could be explained away easily, but the cellar is probably what would kill him. I don't think he would recognize how dangerous Mr. Cooper's infected daughter was because he figures out his neighbor is infected from the news. There's no guarantee that he'll understand the radio or television in the 1960s. Because Korean subtitles in America in the 1960s would be virtually non-existent. That aside, assume he did understand English, assume he wasn't killed immediately because of cultural tensions, and assume he's strong enough to board up the house and smart enough to figure out every aspect of the situation. Jung-woo would still die. Why? Because he would stay in the cellar with everyone else and be overrun. He would see it as a better place to wait out the ghouls because everybody else agrees. There's a very collectivist ideology in Asian countries, especially in places like Japan, China, and Korea. If South Korea is anything like Japan, the reason for this collectivist mindset was because of situations like an apocalypse. And as an island nation, Japan was at the mercy of volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, earthquakes, and violent storms during monsoon seasons. They learned early on that they had to do what was best for the sake of their society as a whole, and those that diverged from the collective were considered dangerous. Many Asian countries share this mindset because of similar early histories. All of that to say that Jung-woo would probably conform to what everybody else wanted to do, and that would lead to my predicted ending. They all go into the cellar after taking the radio down with them, and they're stuck inside with the infected girl. The likelihood that Jung-woo found the gun like Ben did wouldn't be as high because, again, guns aren't common in Korea, and he wouldn't necessarily know to look for it. They'd have to kill the girl with the gardening tools in the basement, but how many would have died or been infected before then? My guess is that he would have died from one of the reanimated corpses and been reanimated himself at some point in the cellar. So no points for Jung-woo in this round. So, after tallying up the points and having several others rate these films on the same categories, the results are in. At an average score of 6 versus 2, Night of the Living Dead comes out on top for this one. After looking over these movies from several angles, I have to say that I actually prefer #Alive over Night, but from a critical lens, I have to agree that Romero really knew what he was doing even early on. His first zombie venture has the commentary spirit and even the simple characters this genre is well known for. And that's why, despite its flaws, Night of the Living Dead won this battle by a landslide. But what do you guys think? Do you think we were completely off saying that Night of the Living Dead was the better movie? Feel free to leave a comment down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Other than that, this is V for Verbatim signing off until the next video. Take care, guys.